The hour hand of life. Life consists of rare, isolated moments of the greatest significance, and of innumerably many intervals, during which at best the silhouettes of those moments hover about us. Love, springtime, every beautiful melody, mountains, the moon, the sea. All these speak completely to the heart but once, if in fact they ever do get a chance to speak completely. For many men do not have those moments at all, and are themselves intervals and intermissions in the symphony of real life. Can violence be a good teacher? In my last video, we discussed how some societies of old, like the ancient Greek or the samurai of the late 1500s, ascribed a deep value to the art of mastering violence. They saw violence and fighting not as an end in and of itself, but rather a means to attain virtue and become a complete person. What was common amongst their philosophies regarding violence was twofold. One, violence was practiced in a controlled manner at first, so the often young individuals that were being trained did not have to experience all of the horrors of the battlefield right from the get-go. And two, the true mastery of violence as the art of war, in the form of combat sports or as duels to the death, expressed itself in one's ability to be truly peaceful and virtuous. However, we were still left with a few questions regarding what we can learn from violence. In this video, let us explore some ideas of the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche and some thoughts by one of the greatest combat sports coaches of all time, John Danaher, to understand violence and the uniqueness of martial arts. Violence is scary, and it is part of our existence. Or is it? Modern psychology claims that violence in the form of killing or hurting other beings for whatever reason is not part of our genetic makeup. So, does my entire thesis fall apart already in the second video? Not really. What the studies say is simply this. While we do have the potential to be violent, there is nothing inherent in us that forces us to be violent, just as there is nothing inherent in our DNA that forces us to be peaceful. As we humans are blessed with intellect, our biggest strength in this world has always been our adaptability to outside phenomena through our ability to problem solve. So it would make sense that there is some level of openness regarding our actions. And while we might not have a natural disposition towards violence, the world we live in is a harsh one. Sure, we may have the choice to abstain from violence in our developed world, but for people and animals fighting for survival thousands and millions of years ago, or some people in lesser developed countries even today, the willingness to be violent, or dare I say dominant, plays an integral role in determining who survives and who doesn't. We humans survived for millions of years because we were able to dominate spaces, then ecosystems, and finally the entire world. And you can see this exact struggle for dominance even in our modern societies, with some people trying their hardest to attain more and more power and influence to dominate other people or even entire aspects of society. The German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche called this innate drive the will to power. Even the body within which individuals treat each other as equals will have to be an incarnate will to power. It will strive to grow, spread, seize, become predominant, not from any morality or immorality, but because it is living, and because life simply is will to power. What Nietzsche is talking about here is much more complex and nuanced than it may seem at first sight, and I will go into greater detail later. For now, let us just keep in mind that he believed that life itself is defined by the will to power. Nietzsche's philosophy developed as a result of the aftermath of the Enlightenment movement and the Industrial Revolution. Over the course of these roughly 200 years prior to Nietzsche's time, scientific truth was separated from religion, education was made more publicly available, and the church started to be separated from state affairs more and more. This prompted many philosophers and writers, among them the likes of Søren Kierkegaard, Fyodor Dostoevsky, and Friedrich Nietzsche, to ponder the questions of morality and meaning in a world where God doesn't exist, thus giving rise to the philosophical movement of existentialism. To explain it briefly, existentialism assumes that life is inherently meaningless, and that as humans we have the freedom to create our own meaning. The questions these philosophers were dealing with still hold immense relevance, today maybe even more so than during their time. We humans survived for millions of years by being great problem solvers. It's what we do. And in our increasingly developed, convenient world where food comes onto our plate in very complex and non-obvious ways, and survival is pretty much guaranteed for most of us, there are very few existential problems left to solve. So we kind of have to create our own problems, find our own manifestations of the will to power that brings us some sort of fulfillment. In my opinion, John Danaher, the greatest jiu-jitsu coach of all time, puts it very well.
And so humanity found itself in a crisis that emerged out of its own success. For most of its history, their only interest was the battle to survive, and they did it. I don't know how they did it, but they did it. They got through ice ages, droughts, famines, disease, everything, and they found a way to get to the top of the food chain. And that's where it all got interesting. Because an organism whose only interest was in survival had, for the first time in their history, a more or less guaranteed survival. And so they start casting their mind around, okay, what do I do now? And so the minute mankind's existence became more or less guaranteed, the problems shift from survival to meaning. And we found ourselves grappling with a whole new issue that had never occurred to our ancient forefathers, but which now becomes one of the centerpieces of our modern lives.
One thing that I would like to add to Danaher's point is this. It seems like technological advancement has happened way too fast for our brains to keep up. Evolutionary processes take thousands, if not millions of years, meaning we are still wired to exist in small communities of a few hundred people whose work and opinions we depend on, not cities of millions depending on global supply chains, complicated diplomacy, or social media. I think that exactly this is one of the big reasons for the rise in depression and anxiety amongst younger generations. Now, before I make the jump to martial arts, let me fulfill my promise from earlier and explain Nietzsche's concept of the will to power in more detail. What Nietzsche is talking about here is not simply the will to dominate everything around you, climb the social ladder, and be an alpha male. No. What Nietzsche is talking about is the cycle of becoming and overcoming yourself, in a steady process of making your life a piece of art, doing what is natural to you, inconsiderate of outside influences, never settling. This is not to be taken in a neurotic way, but rather a very joyful one, so that finally, at the end of your life, you will have turned every it was into an I wanted it so. It is a call to radical proactivity, claiming responsibility for your own life, making conscious decisions, and embarking on a never-ending journey of constant rediscovery. To redeem what is past, and to transform every it was into thus would I have it. That only do I call redemption. Away from those fabulous songs did I lead you when I taught you the will is a creator. All it was is a fragment, a riddle, a fearful chance, until the creating will said, but thus would I have it. Until the creating will said, but thus do I will it. Thus shall I will it. With the philosophical groundwork laid, let's finally get to martial arts and what makes fighting so special. What I talked about just now can be boiled down to a few core ideas. 1. The absence of a god and the resulting structural changes have led us to question our purpose in life. 2. We quote-unquote lost our daily struggle for survival and exchanged processes of getting food or shelter for much more complex ones. 3. This increasing complexity has also made our problems more complex, leading us to attach ourselves to insignificant and abstract things or concepts. And finally, 4. Ideally, we can find something which gives us purpose, restores our sense of community, puts our ambitions and priorities into perspective, and provides us with tools to overcome ourselves and find fulfillment. It would be cool if fighting could do all of this for us, right? Unfortunately, it can't, but I do think that it can help us with a few things. while we may not or also should not look to fighting as our only true purpose in life, I firmly believe that it can help us learn humility, perspective, and community, and above all provide us with a way of becoming and overcoming ourselves, which we can then apply to other areas of life, leading to true confidence and power in the form of mastery of the self, akin to what the ancient Greek or the samurai of late Sengoku and early Edo period Japan hailed as the highest form of human existence. Most of these things we will examine in the next videos of this series. Since today we are only concerned with what makes martial arts so special, the only question really left to answer is how I personally believe that fighting can teach us all of this. Another quick side note regarding this point. I think that it is no coincidence that insanely powerful people like Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg have started to find great enjoyment in training martial arts. Their power is very complex, and as pointed out in my first video, violence is a very primordial and therefore simple fear that many of us have in our day-to-day lives. To me, it only makes sense that they enjoy exactly this simplicity, this primordial aspect of life that at the same time makes them feel more secure as a person and is unattached to their achievements in the quote-unquote real world. The simplicity of fighting is actually a big factor of why I think training in combat sports is so addictive to so many people. The rules for advancing are rather clear. In the gym, you have a somewhat meritocratic system, provided there's live sparring, and improvements in your ability are tangible and measurable and can be directly attributed to the effort you put into your training. In the real world, this is not always the case. As I already mentioned earlier, in our day-to-day lives, simple processes like getting food, shelter, or clothing appear to be less obvious, and we often don't feel a clear causal effect between what we do for work and what we get out of it. However, in any sport that involves a lot of skill and competition, this exact feeling of causality is provided, which brings me to my next point. Fighting is unique. Fighting has a very unique set of attributes. First of all, it's a very physically demanding and a very physical sport. If there were no referees or rules, the physical implication of losing a fight might as well mean death, and our lizard brain recognizes this way more than it recognizes the actual scenarios we find ourselves in. Of course, there are many other sports with severe physical implications, like American football or lacrosse, which can give you severe brain damage. But the main difference between these sports and fighting is that the goal of American football or lacrosse, for example, is not to hurt the other person, whereas in combat sports, it oftentimes is. When you fight, you go into the fight knowing full well that the other person has the worst intentions for you, that they're trying their hardest to break or hurt you as badly as they can to win the fight. And you also know that if you do not go in the fight with the same intentions, you might be in for a very rough time. The resulting adrenaline rush makes it very physically demanding, as you will have to endure physical discomfort and pain in order to get to the win, and might even be forced to reach beyond your physical limits. Secondly, competing or being able to compete in most combat sports on a high level requires a lot of individual skill. As all forms of serious martial arts are one-on-one matches, individual skill will play the biggest factor in whether someone wins or loses. Sure, the coaches and teammates or training partners also play a big role in the development of skills and confidence, but in the end it will be only the athlete who has to apply these skills to the match itself. Skill can be defined twofold. Technical skill, which is your physical ability to perform a certain move as accurate as possible, and so-called fight IQ, which is the ability to choose the correct techniques in a given scenario in very short windows of opportunity. Fight IQ leads us to the third defining factor. Fighting is as much mental as it is physical. I don't know who said it first, but I once heard Israel Adesanya, one of the greatest middleweights of all time, say it once. Fighting is not a split between mental and physical abilities. It's not 40% physical, 60% mental, or any other split. It is 100% mental and 100% physical. As a fighter on a high level, you need to be locked in both mentally and physically. And if you neglect one of both parts, you will not perform on the highest level. Let me break it down further to you. Before preparing for a fight, or if you're out of fight camp, it's all about having the right mindset to improve, training with a direction, and always adding new skills to your arsenal. Performance doesn't matter that much. This changes as soon as you start preparing for a fight. Performance is everything. You want to focus on the skills you're good at, and you want to refine those skills to gain confidence in using them in a fight. Lastly, during the fight, ideally, you won't have any thoughts at all. You will only focus on the moment, existing in a sort of flow state. Although skill and confidence go along fairly often, you will sometimes find fighters who are highly skilled but lack confidence, which results in them losing to opponents who are much less skilled but much more confident in themselves. Let's use all of this to come back to Nietzsche, Danaher, and creating meaning in our lives. The uniqueness of fighting and combat sports that I just pointed out can, in my opinion, serve as a great catalyst for learning tools to become and overcome ourselves. Facing your fears and overcoming adversity. Fighting is scary, even for seasoned fighters. The strong reaction of our nervous system gives us a crippling fear of death, injury, and humiliation before fights. During fights, we might experience adrenaline dumps and start feeling intense pain in our bodies or be incredibly fatigued, but we still have to push through no matter what. Overcoming these sometimes overwhelming feelings and overwhelming fears gives us an inner strength and helps us put other things into perspective. Is talking to strangers really that scary compared to fighting someone else who is trained in martial arts? What about public speaking or a job interview? These are just some of the things that, for many of us, trigger our fight or flight instincts and thus make us feel nervous or anxious, but carry way less implications than an actual fight. Humility, appreciating mistakes, and accepting losses. Making mistakes and losing are a big part of life, and they build character. Our modern society, especially elite academia or professional environments, give people the sense that they cannot ever make mistakes, that losing is a bad thing. However, if you're truly committed to developing a skill and getting better at it, learning from mistakes plays a very crucial role in achieving mastery. If you try your hardest, you will make mistakes, and maybe even lose sometime. And if you can't handle a crushing defeat because of an important mistake you made, you only got as far as you got out of luck, not out of skill, and definitely not because of your character. Embracing violence as a part of life. Coming back to my first video, voluntarily facing the reality of violence can help us be more confident and more compassionate. We realize how, although fighting and violence is very scary, that fear is not insurmountable and it is possible to overcome it. At the same time, we can learn how to show humility, lose the need to prove ourselves to others, and be more compassionate, as we know how scary violence can be, and that overcoming that fear does not come easy. Community. Apart from the drive for continuous improvement and mastery, I have mostly talked about combat sports in the context of competition, and I do think that competition is one of the biggest aspects when it comes to lessons we can learn from fighting. Yet, ignoring the competitive aspect, I feel like community is one of the biggest and definitely the most wholesome aspect when it comes to training in martial arts. Of course, you will also have a strong sense of community in team sports, but I have seen very few places where such tight-knit friendships have been formed as in combat sports gyms. The trust required to play fight with someone and knowing that they don't intend to hurt or injure you, even if they do end up hurting and injuring you, creates very strong bonds between people. You can even see this in UFC rivalries. After 25 minutes of sworn enemies trying to batter each other unconscious, break their bones, and inflict as much damage on the opponent as possible, the fighters are often left with nothing but respect for one another. Of course, these are just my personal opinions and observations, and you might come to completely different conclusions. Maybe you grew up learning these virtues, or you think they're useless, or you learned them through a different medium. All of this doesn't really matter, because my only claim is that these are all things that we can learn from fighting, not that fighting is the only thing that can teach us all of this. While we did explore some of the lessons we can learn from martial arts and consequently from violence in this video, and while they may help us be better technicians or maybe even inspire us to apply them to different areas of life, I still feel that they are very surface level and don't do my claims of learning what it means to be human and achieving true pacifism through the embrace of violence justice. We still need to discover exactly this: how violence can lead us to true pacifism, a pacifism that comes from a position of strength instead of weakness. But before we get there, we need to take a look at the pitfalls of this journey, and we have to examine why most popular fighters are neither happy nor good people. We will have to talk about fame, money, and what I believe to be the root of all evil: ego.